Somewhere in a Roman vault, our continent exists as paperwork, petitions, denunciations, missionary reports, lists of idols seized, names of villages spelled wrong but punished correctly, pages that decide what was allowed to live and what was ordered to vanish. Not legends, files, the kind written in calm handwriting while whole communities were being rewired. In colonial Latin America, violence wasn't only in swords or fire, it was in documents that traveled farther than the people they judged. Tonight, we follow that paper trail from New Spain and the Andes to the shelves where the empire's memory was filed, renamed, and made technically accessible, yet practically invisible. Shh! Listen carefully. Latin America doesn't shout, it whispers. I'm Arturo. This is Latin Lora, myths, history, and actual cases, told straight and sourced. Subscribe because every week, another hidden story comes to light. They had already decided before the fire was lit, before the first painted fold was carried into the courtyard, before the witnesses understood what kind of day it would become. The decision lived in ink, in the language of error and correction, in the calm certainty that a world can be dismantled the way a clerk dismantles a file, object by object, until only approved paper remains. We can almost see it without romance. Bundles were set down on a table, skins creased from use, pigments dulled by hands and breath, idols gathered in heaps like confiscated tools, a list drafted with the patience of a man convinced that patience is holiness. The terrible part is how ordinary it feels when it happens under a roof with rules. In Yucatán, in Maní, in 1562, a Franciscan named Diego de Landa presided over an auto de fe. The phrase itself, act of faith, does not need embellishment because it was an act, and it demanded a stage, and it demanded smoke. What burned there was not only wood and cloth, not only figures carved and painted, but books, the kind of books Europe did not know how to read and therefore had to fear. Folded screen folds carrying calendars and auguries, divinatory cosmology, obligations between days and bodies and weather, the mathematics of ritual time. The books became contraband. What made them dangerous was never their beauty. It was their authority. A painted codex or a ritual bundle could govern time, duty, sickness, harvest, marriage, and fate without a priest's permission, and in a Christian empire that looked like a rival scripture and a rival court. Later, with a steadiness that still chills, Landa wrote that they burned them all as if all were a simple quantity. He even recorded the grief, then moved on, as if grief were a minor inconvenience in the repair of souls. We do not need to pretend this is uncertain. It sits inside the record of conquest as plainly as a scar. It is not unique because the mind that made it possible was already traveling through New Spain and the Andes, carried by missionaries, bishops, extirpators, local magistrates, men trained to identify idolatry the way a notary identifies forged seals. When we speak of indigenous books burned, we are not describing a handful of dramatic bonfires staged for spectacle. We are describing a policy that treated indigenous religious media as an enemy scripture and a competing authority. We inherited languages pushed into confessionals and classrooms. We inherited ceremonies that forced us to change our clothing. We inherited the emptiest inheritance of all, the gaps where libraries once stood. Fire is loud and final, and it tempts the mind to stop at the smoke. The deeper violence is administrative, and it does not end with ash. Before something disappears, it is named, handled, and weighed in the mind as evidence, and that is where the machinery grows more intricate. The same hands that could throw a manuscript into flames could also set it aside, not out of mercy, but out of use. The colonial world wanted proof. It wanted exhibits. It wanted objects that could be shown to justify punishment, to instruct novices, to demonstrate the devil's cleverness in pigment and hide. Confiscation ran alongside destruction, and sometimes it outran it. In towns and villages, objects were gathered as if for an inventory. Bundles, costumes, carved figures, painted pages, anything that could carry a rite without a priest. The phrase that comes down to us, extirpation of idolatry, sounds clinical until we remember what extirpation means in the body: uprooting, cutting out and leaving a wound open to the air. In practice, it meant campaigns that moved through communities seeking the media of the old religion, not only idols in the narrow sense, but also the means of remembering, repeating, and teaching. The story is not neat, because the empire and the church were not in a single hand with a single rulebook everywhere. In New Spain, much of the policing of indigenous religion sat in missionary discipline, episcopal courts, and local campaigns. The Inquisition existed, and it mattered, but it did not simply swallow all indigenous life into one black mouth. In the Andes, extirpation developed its own rhythms, its own visits, its own routinized interrogations and seizures. Variety did not soften it, it multiplied its doors. One priest looked away, and another zealot arrived. One judge demanded proof, another confession. Between them, an object could be burned, buried, hidden, or filed. Filing is where the violence becomes quiet and persistent. Paper trails breed paper trails. Copies appear, marginal notes accumulate. A ritual bundle becomes a case becomes precedent becomes instruction for the next man. In that paper world, an indigenous manuscript could survive in the worst way, as a specimen of error, frozen under labels it never chose. Imagine the moment without melodrama. A deerskin screen fold opened on a desk, a translator standing to one side, an official leaning in, not to admire, but to extract. He asked what each image meant, not because he wanted to understand it as its makers did, but because he wanted a usable paraphrase, something that fit the vocabulary of heresy and superstition. He wrote in the margin. He translated danger into European language. He converted living knowledge into a manageable category. The manuscript changed in that moment, not in its pigments, but in its fate. It became hybrid, vulnerable, misread, and yet harder to erase completely because it now had a place in a system that loves places. This is how power kept what it condemned. Alongside that, another kind of survival occurred, older and more intimate, carried by the people who had the most to lose. Concealment, a book folded and wrapped and pushed behind a stone, a bundle hidden under floorboards, a ritual object moved at night, a text circulated quietly in households that learned to breathe softly when a stranger approached. Not every survival was a triumph. Many survivals were amputations. Prayers were rewritten into acceptable forms. Histories were framed as chronicles for Christian ears. Indigenous or hybrid texts learned to wear a saint's name like a cloak. A Nahua manuscript might speak of Christ while the cadence of an older calendar still pulsed underneath, not as rebellion in the modern sense, but as continuity under pressure. We can admit our own complexity here, because we are not only victims in this story, we adapted. We chose what to hide and what to show. We translated ourselves into forms that would not be destroyed. Sometimes that saved a page. Sometimes it saved a family. Sometimes it saved nothing but a rumor that a book once existed. Then the trail of custody stretched, and distance became its own instrument. The smoke of Yucatán did not stay in Yucatán. It drifted into correspondence, into collections, into the slow suction of objects toward capitals, and eventually toward Rome. We do not need melodrama to explain it. The old world had channels for this movement. Friars traveled, bishops corresponded, collectors acquired, gifts changed hands, curiosities were transported, copies were made for patrons, items left their communities without a clean ledger of how or why. The chain often breaks precisely where it matters most. At the moment, an object crosses from local life into institutional custody. Yet in Rome, the story becomes painfully concrete again, not because it becomes clearer, but because it becomes numbered. The Vatican Library exists as an address and a vault, and within it sit Mexican pictorial manuscripts under Latin shelf marks that read like a second baptism. Vaticanus Latinus 3773, commonly called Codex Vaticanus B, a Mexican pictorial manuscript on deerskin, a screenfold made for divination, dense with day signs and calendrical auguries, a technology for reading fate that colonial campaigns feared because it let a community interpret the world without permission. Vaticanus Latinus 3738, often called Codex Vaticanus A, also known as Codex Ríos, a manuscript whose very form reveals the colonial moment that shaped it, indigenous cosmology and ritual reframed and explained through European annotation, copied and expanded in a way that carried knowledge into European libraries, even as the living context back home was disciplined and thinned. These are not legends, they are holdings, and holdings change the terms of survival. A codex preserved under glass is still a codex removed from the hands that once used it as a living calendar. It is still a book exiled into climate control and catalog language. The mind wants to call that forbidden knowledge. The sharper truth is less theatrical. It is available in principle and unreachable in practice. The barriers are not always chains. They are training, language, distance, and the old geometry of empire that decides whose life can include time in a reading room. The Vatican Apostolic Archive sits beside this story like a darker twin, because it is not a museum of images, but a continent of paper. It used to be called the Vatican Secret Archive, and the name was changed for good reason. Secretum meant private, not hidden from humanity. The change does not alter the lived reality for most of us. Access exists, but it is reserved for specialists. A qualified researcher can enter, request files, read the correspondence on evangelization and governance, the petitions, the reports, and the letters that carried the pulse of colonial Latin America back to Rome. Open does not mean near. Open does not mean equal. Open does not mean that the descendants of the people described on those pages can simply walk in and reclaim their own history as if history were an object left on a bench. Somewhere in that archive world, within the records of evangelization and administration, there are traces of what was destroyed and what was seized, traces that survive because officials were meticulous, because they believed meticulousness was virtue. We face an irony that was not designed, only inherited. To understand what was burned in the Americas, scholars often read about it in Europe, in languages chosen by the colonizers, through the eyes of men trained to see indigenous media as error. The Codex survives, and so does the condemnation written around it. The painted page endures, and so does the label that tried to kill its meaning. We can name what happened without begging for absolution. The church in colonial Latin America burned indigenous books, and the same church, through its institutions and their long afterlives, became one of the keepers of what remained. We can also name what is harder to accept because it feels like it belongs to another age, but it does not. The asymmetry continues in the simple fact of where these materials sit, who can touch them, who can read them without mediation, and whose language frames their description. The past did not only die in fire, it was processed. It was translated into categories that could be stored. It was renamed into shelf marks. It was filed and refiled as administrations changed, as titles were revised, as collections grew. A deerskin manuscript once opened by daykeepers became a number in a Latin sequence. A cosmology became an object. A living calendar became a specimen. Once something becomes a specimen, it can be preserved indefinitely while remaining distant from the people it once served. We live with that distance not as an abstract grievance, but as a condition of knowledge. We live with it when the story of our own memory requires passports, permissions, paleography, and the ability to spend weeks in silence beneath ceilings painted by another world. The most unsettling part is how clean it all looks from the outside. A careful vault, a controlled room, a calm ledger, a professional catalog, a renamed archive whose doors are technically open. The flame is gone. The smoke has cleared. The system that once decided what should burn still decides what becomes legible, what becomes authoritative, what becomes the record. Nothing closes here because nothing truly closed when the fire died. The destruction ended. The handling did not. Our history was not only taken away. Just so you know, it was arranged. Arrangement can outlast violence with a gentleness that feels like mercy until we remember what gentleness can conceal. What survives is not only what escaped the bonfire, it is what was captured by paperwork, carried across oceans, and taught to answer to a foreign name, waiting on a shelf, not hidden in the mythical sense, placed where most of us will never stand. Thank you for walking these hidden paths with me. If this story unsettled you, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. The search for Latin America's darkest corners has only just begun.